Awesome. All right, thank you. So here we go. Again, thanks you guys for being here. And I was expecting, an even smaller audience. So it's nice to see people that I know. And this should be about 40 to 45 minutes of information. And then, hopefully you'll still be able to be here and we can do any kind of questions that you might have. You can also, of course, post them in the chat. And I have put in the chat a link to a document that is just a PDF on Google Drive that has citations for all of the science that you'll see and a few of the other references that you'll see in this presentation. And okay, so here we go. Let me see if I can get my phone to cooperate. And yes, it does. All right, so this idea here, what I really want to do with this presentation and sort of the future direction of biointegrity is inspire people to think more creatively about the future based on a strong understanding of our biospheric history. And this idea that we're all designers is familiar to a lot of the environmental folks. It's talked about a lot in green design. But, environmental person or not, think about it a little bit for a minute. We all, of course, design the way we look. We design our personal spaces, whether it's your kitchen or your living room or your car or your workspace. And we interact, of course, with the local environment. And we design and interact with the global environment. And of course, our feelings, the way we respond to each other. So this phrase, practice making love-based decisions, has been really, really helpful to our family this year. We're big fans of this guy, Karamo Brown, and he's in the citations document that I mentioned a moment ago. That's, if you go to the chat, you can find a link to that there to get it off of Google Docs. But in regards to this idea of us all being designers, so the starting place for being a designer and the framework that we apply to designing anything, I think is the most important thing to get right. And so that's what this presentation aims to do, is connect us all to a bigger understanding of what it really means to be alive, and how we should act in the future because of that. And this beautiful phrase, it's on the wall in my office. And as I mentioned, it's been important to our family this year in this difficult time. So for those of you that I haven't met yet, my name's Chris Searles. I started a nonprofit project officially about a year ago. It's called Biointegrity. But before that, I spent about 5 years doing research and presentations about tropical forests under the name Biointegrity, because I really, I felt that the information around tropical forests was so important that I just had to dive in, learn as much as I could, and share it as fast as I could, and help the nonprofit organizations working on tropical forests as best I could. We'll come back to biointegrity and tropical forests in a minute. So this presentation is, terminology-wise, we're talking about the whole planet again. This is a global concept. We'll talk about local to global and global to local, but the big ideas here are biosphere, which, if you're not familiar with that term, you'll hear it a lot in the next few minutes. This applies to the composition of all of the organisms on Earth that have created the elements and the materials that we require for survival, that made it possible for us to exist, and obviously that keep us going, that are the basis of anything: the economy, philosophy, economics, religion, everything that's ever happened for us as human beings is a result of what the biosphere makes possible for us. And the biosphere is propagated by biodiversity, which just means the variety of life on Earth. This is all of the organisms on Earth, from the microorganisms to the macroorganisms, like a blue whale, or from the insects to the plants and animals and human beings. And biointegrity, the idea here is that we're talking about biospheric integrity, which has become, unfortunately, an urgent concern in the last few decades, and particularly in the last decade. So this presentation, Building a Brighter Future with Intact Ecosystems, that's my wife hugging the tree there on the right at a nature preserve in Austin. And basically, all I'm really telling you throughout this whole presentation is that protecting and increasing wildernesses or wild biodiverse ecosystems all over the planet, particularly where they are the most productive, is our most effective way to stop climate change and build a better community as we restore the resources that we need to have an abundant, vibrant economy, a healthy humanity. And it's also, of course, the way to stop and reverse the biosphere crisis that we're now facing, which is starting to become more known in the popular press. And there's plenty of recent doomsday science to document this idea that we have to move as fast as we possibly can to transform the bad actors and protect and restore the ecosystems that make it possible for us to have anything. So these apocalyptic ideas, this slide, I gave a different version of some of this presentation a few weeks ago on Indigenous Peoples Day to a friend's class at Austin Community College. And it's an apocalyptic fiction class. And so I sort of started out with them by saying, you know, this presentation is a response to real world apocalypse, what we should do about real world apocalypse. They're reading about science fiction and, you know, kind of other ideas of fantasy and apocalyptic things. But we actually do, you know, I can't stress it enough. We do have to change the way that we're doing things. And I think this, this presentation hopefully, again, gives you a good grounding for how we should think forward from here. And we can start by looking at Mars in terms of what's so great about Earth, or you know, what are our chances of getting off of this planet and starting over. So Mars, just as a comparison, it doesn't have enough carbon to build a biosphere. It doesn't have enough water to build a biosphere. The soils are too salty for microbial life. The average planetary temperature is 81 degrees below Fahrenheit. There's no atmosphere. It's basically a rock with dust, just, you know, frozen dust floating around relatively close to Earth. But when you compare Earth to Mars, there's no comparison. Earth has had continuous life on it for roughly the last 4 billion years. Mars hasn't had life for at least the last 3 billion years, and maybe never. We still haven't found any microbes off of Earth in the entire universe. And NASA has surveyed, you know, obviously with telescopes, but NASA has surveyed over 4,200 planets, and of the exoplanets that are most potentially capable of hosting life, there's just not anything that is even similar to Earth. There's not even a simple biosphere or a microbial biosphere yet found on an asteroid or a planet. And when we're talking about going to places like Centauri B, that's 130,000 years of travel, roughly, with current technology. So back to Earth and Mars. Earth, in a biblical sense, Earth would be Eden, Mars would be a frozen hell. And this is what makes Earth so special for us, is this complex life biosphere, the larger organisms. And they are cycling because of the moisture that evaporates off of the waters and moves over the lands. They are cycling life all the time. We live inside of a biosphere. We live inside of a bunch of different activity happening all the time. I like to say there's no such thing as the environment. There's just the biosphere. We all live inside of the biosphere, and it's a planetary biosphere. But historically speaking, life began in the waters, according to the science. And so life circulates from you know, every aspect inside of the waters. And of course, connects, organisms connect between the waters and the lands. Some organisms stay discreetly only in the lands or in the grasslands and the deserts and so forth. And then there are organisms that link the grasslands to the forest lands. The forest lands are the most productive in terms of concentration. But what you see here, hopefully, is this interlocking series of rings that are, you know, an infinite loop of biospheric productivity that just come from organisms living. Every organism wants to live to its fullest extent. And this is a strength that we can use and rely on as we address climate change, as we address poverty, as we think about building a brighter future for everyone. Mars, on the other hand, it just doesn't have anything going on. So you'll notice the slide on the right, or the picture on the right of this slide, is animated. that's because Earth is animated by its life. And what you're seeing there is the different seasonal acquisitions of carbon by vegetation. But Mars, by comparison, and those little yellow dots are just satellite landings, or whatever we call that, spaceship landings, exploratory landings. Mars has nothing going on except a dust storm that covers the entire planet, I think 2 or 3 times a year. And radiation that can kill a human being in short time. And no atmosphere. It's kind of to me, a kind of a practical joke that we would be talking about going to Mars. And it's certainly a interesting comparison to Earth. And the idea that we might be turning Earth into Mars and thinking we can turn Mars into Earth, when we really need to be focusing on Earth right now. So how did we get here? How did we get to this time today where we have this robust biosphere that's still able to support us even when it's under such stress? And it's a pretty simple story scientifically. One more time, there's a PDF that you can find in the comments here, or the chat here, that will give you citations for the science that you're seeing in this presentation. And so the history of life on Earth in a nutshell is that it began roughly 4 billion years ago. There's various thoughts about it could have been 4.5 billion years ago, or 3.78, or exactly 4, and it doesn't really matter. But it existed at a microbial scale on this planet for about 3.5 billion years. There were no plants and animals. And then around 600 million years ago, the first complex life appeared. And that complex life is what we call plants, animals, insects. This is what we relate to. These are macroorganisms. So simple life would be organisms that you can't see. They're inside your body, and they're outside of your body. They're basically everywhere moisture is. We're more familiar with this idea because of COVID-19, obviously. But just about anywhere there's moisture. So there's science that shows microbiology has been found at, I think, somewhere in the range of 50 miles below the bottom of the seafloor in the subterranean rock, and at the highest heights in the atmosphere. Anywhere there's moisture, there is a habitat for microbiology now on this planet. And our biosphere began about 65 million years ago. The dinosaurs went extinct when the planet crashed around 66 million years ago, and it's believed that within a few 100,000 years, the biosphere kind of restarted. And then our species, the Homo sapiens, didn't appear until around 300,000 years ago. And all of this stuff is subject to change. It kind of moves around a little bit, but this timeline is the general outline of the history of life on Earth and how we got here to having a complex life biosphere that can support human beings and the human economy. So the way it balances architecturally is that the foundation of the complex life biosphere that we call reality, that system is built on a microbial system, on this microbial life system. I wish I were just talking about that, and I wish I knew a lot more about that, but the microbial system, among many other things, it provides us with these 2 unbelievable services, which is decomposition of all the material elements that are biological, and then also the redistribution of those elements throughout the biosphere so that new life can eat, and new life can grow, and new life can be productive. And it's just one of the true miracles of reality is the microbial services that we rely on. What's happening in the big picture is life is just cycling from the micro to the macro to the micro to the macro all the time. And that kind of looks like this idea that the micro life is, of course, feeding plants, and the plants are feeding the plants and animals, and the plants and animals are feeding the microbes. And it just goes around and around and around from micro to macro and macro to micro. And you can kind of think of the biosphere in terms of its functionality as it just all being food chains, complementary food chains that are interacting. And we want these food chains to be natural and robust. It's a self-organizing system that made it possible for us to be here. Again, we didn't show up until very recently in the history of this 4 billion year old life support system. And when I spoke at that class at ACC a few weeks ago, it was Indigenous Peoples Day, which was part of the reason we connected to the class. And there's a saying that I found when I was doing some research on Native American spirituality a few years ago, and I put the link in the PDF. The YouTube video has now been pulled down, so I can't quite back up the idea that this is a common saying, but there was a Navajo man in a video saying that to Native Americans, the universe is the circle of circles. And this is true for the biosphere, that it's the cycle of cycles. Everything is cycling circularly all the time. Life and moisture is constantly moving around in the system. This is what keeps it alive, just like your body. Your body is a series of interacting organs, and the biosphere is a series of interacting organisms and ecosystems. And so the moisture part of this is crucial, especially in the sense of why would we restore the biosphere and why do we care about the biosphere? What is it doing for us? So again, the moisture that evaporates off of the ocean and off of open lakes and other forms of water, when it falls onto vegetation, the vegetation can capture it, because this very simple idea that there's more surface area, and this leaves and grasses have the ability to hold more moisture than concrete, than metal, obviously. And the same thing with soils. Soils have a spongy quality where they can really expand to manage all kinds of volumes of water. And so once the moisture has fallen out of the sky onto the natural ecosystems, they want to hold on to it. The organisms want to hold on to it, and they will naturally cycle it around as long as possible. The more robust your local ecosystem is, the more vegetated and naturally self-managing it is, the better it can do this job of holding moisture and cycling it around for a long time. And that provides you with so many benefits that are absolutely critical right now. Top of the list are keeping a microclimate stable, keeping things cool. In addition to that, the productivity of the place. And we'll come back to this concept in a minute as well. But then eventually, some of this moisture immediately goes up and away. And as the air moves through, the moisture goes up and away onto the next place and is transported through the air around the planet. And this cycling life and moisture is constantly happening for us. We care about this because this process of life cycles and moisture cycles interacting is filtering our fresh water. More than half of the fresh water that we drink in the United States comes, before it comes out of your faucet, it goes through a forest filtration system first, a natural filtration system. And we can increase that through reforestation. This cooling aspect, it manages temperature. It keeps temperature spikes at bay, and it prevents temperature spikes in varying ways depending on the volume of the weather and the volume of the ecosystem and so forth. But it's the best tool we have. There is no technology to deal with temperature. There is only biology to deal with temperature. And so biology, that species, these ecosystems, of course, are habitat for the species that are providing these services that we require. It's the biodiversity that's doing the work. And biodiversity and life is carbon-based. So the more life we encourage to live here, the more carbon we can pull out of the atmosphere from industrial emissions. And some people believe we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere from, that's already been emitted by human beings over the last few decades through revegetation. And last but not least, all of this stuff is adding up to create our life support services. Literally, there was no oxygen on Earth 4 billion years ago. It took about 1 billion years for oxygen to be created by the first microorganisms. And so oxygen, freshwater filtration, food production, so on and so forth, the life support aspect of what we take for granted is provided by these ecosystems and these cycles of life. Here again is the picture of the global biosphere. And this is a NASA satellite image, or series of images. This is putting together 20 years of weather and carbon accumulation in vegetation, as I mentioned a minute ago, and compressing it into a continuous loop. So if you look at the United States first, you notice that the white descends, and that's just winter. That's the snowy winter coming down. But if you look below that at South America, and then in the heart of the South America is the Amazon. That big green area stays green the entire time. The white snowy bits come and go. But if you look at South America and the Amazon, and then if you look across to Africa, in Central Africa where the Congo and the West African tropical forests are, and then you look across again below India to the Southeast Asian islands of Indonesia and Malaysia, and also Papua New Guinea, you see that they are green year-round. This is one of the most critical concepts for how we approach absorbing emissions. The ecosystems at the planet, particularly tropical forests and tropical grasslands, are the most concentrated and most productive systems on the planet. They pull in carbon faster than any other resource we have, technologically or otherwise. And the rest of the sort of biospheric productive ecosystems are the coastal areas. All of our coastlines are critical for biospheric productivity. All of the tropical ecosystems are critical for biospheric productivity. And the northern and southern oceans are critical. And we don't have time to get into that much further, but this is what you're seeing here is what we call reality. This is our biosphere cycling carbon and creating life support services for us. On a sort of conceptual level, what this means and looks like is that our biospheric reality is that people or our individual lives are in the middle of a system. And so it's sort of people, and then we have our beliefs and our communities, our cultures, the larger sort of societal organization. Then we have, there we go. Then we have the ecosystem, sorry, the economy that is making it possible for, pointer went away. Here it is, okay. The economy, of course, is fed by ecosystems. And then the ecosystems are comprising the biosphere, all of the ecosystems around the planet. Again, we care about this ecosystems and biosphere because it's creating all of these things for us that we have to have. There's no time to debate anything if we don't have these things for us. And then another thing that we're learning from indigenous peoples around the world is this another big, simple, beautiful idea that we are reliant on other organisms 100%. We don't get to let go of the biosphere just because we now have cool technology. And so indigenous peoples have never forgotten this. They are, especially in the tropics, they're surrounded by so much of a relational reality that with the other organisms, that they understand this basic principle that we depend on other organisms. You design around the relational reality with other organisms. So again, this looks like this idea that from a biospheric perspective, reality is relationships. Everything is relationships, the circle of circles. And this idea that life, living in the biosphere are relationships, if that's hard to grasp, this is something I told the students, it may not be hard to grasp for this group, but look at the things that you know already that are not human, that are other organisms. So you can look at your pets. Intelligence is in every organism. Every organism knows how to adapt to climate conditions, knows how to feed itself, knows how to reproduce, knows how to communicate and network so that it can stay alive. And so, whether you're talking about your cats and your pets and your dogs that we have affectionate relationships with, or like this insect that jumped on my wife's hand, try to observe how they respond to you. Try to observe that the other organisms are basically afraid of us. They're not out to get us. And they all together, we comprise this system of life. This is from North Austin that makes all of these things that we have to have. So another aspect of this big conversation on the environment, of course, is that we get overwhelmed so quickly because there's so much bad news. And this slide from that college presentation, I really wanted to talk to them about this idea. What do you do about this apocalyptic time that we're living in environmentally? What does the world do? What can I do individually? And it's very simple. We just need to advance humanity by reversing the paradigm of biospheric destruction. We're doing pretty well culturally on the idea of decarbonization, but we have yet to really embrace this idea that we need to protect the old growth ecosystems that remain on our planet. We need to transform the bad actors that are destroying biospheric integrity on our planet and turn them into asset generators for the biosphere. We'll talk about these three ideas as we go forward here. And we need to restore ecosystems. We need to restore connectivity of ecosystems. We need to restore and integrate the integrity of the biosphere in the new context where there are people everywhere. This is kind of the goal, that we're climate change or not, We want to repopulate the vibrance of our planet as
Telling
quickly as
your
we
nose
can.
job is
It's
great.
taken less than
It
100
makes me
years
happy.
to really do serious damage to our planet biospherically. And so the worst, scariest sounding study, there are many I could name off the top of my head, from Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and numerous individual studies that are saying we have to change everything by 2030 in terms of what we're doing wrong. But the scariest one, I think, is saying that just continuing the current rate of deforestation, we have a less than 10% chance of avoiding collapse for civilization before 2040. And between the years of 2040 and 2060, that we're already engaged in collapse. And stopping that and reversing that doesn't just get us out of this biospheric crisis, it addresses climate change on numerous scales, which you'll see going forward in a moment. The idea of local action, and how do you connect locally to global biospheric integrity? What do we do? Pretty simple. We want to rebuild the infrastructure that we've taken away in this new context. So from the smallest places, from potted plants and gardens and school yards and so forth, to parks and highway medians and public spaces, and with corridors connecting these places, making them overlap. And ultimately, we want to connect to the biggest ecosystems, the biggest wildernesses. We want Austin to be connected to Big Bend, and to Big Bend to be connected to Yellowstone, and Austin to be connected to the Amazon. We want to create a new type of connectivity that is not yet really being talked about in the popular sphere. This idea can be accomplished relatively simply if everyone begins to think in this way. So starting with the back porch, wherever you live, the plants that you have there, if you have a yard, you can try to let this yard rewild itself. You can cultivate your yard for greater productivity of native plants and so forth. You can make your yard a productive food space. We can use school gardens for curriculum, for engagement opportunities for children, socialization in the near future. We can convert community spaces. These can be destination places for people to gather in their neighborhoods, also ways to grow food and make compost and enrich your soil and share space and resources. Parks obviously are critical and an important positive step. Notice in the photo to the right that all but one of the kids is just smiling and beaming ear to ear, which is hard to capture in photos sometimes, this natural moment of bliss. But for some reason, which there is science on as well, we have a biological relationship in the outdoors when we're comfortable and feel safe outdoors that is just more positive than being indoors, believe it or not. And what we're doing with these things is integrating and restoring wilderness functionality back into the greater community. So expanding on this connectivity idea, there are medians that are not being used. They could be used for pollinator space. They can be used for stormwater management. There are rooftops galore that we can convert, whether we turn them into grass roofs or put boxes on them and use them as plantings for various types of things. There are green walls. We can vegetate walls. And both of these photos are from Austin. This is Benu Coffee and the parking garage over by Central Market on North Lamar. And then this building, one of them's in Singapore and the other's in Bogota. But this is showing that we can really design at mass scale for this integrated wilderness idea, for bringing vegetation back. And the larger photo of the building, this photo offsets the carbon footprint of its inhabitants over a number of years. It cleans particulate emissions from transportation. Obviously, at various times of the year, it's a beautiful thing, and it provides habitat for pollinators and so forth. We want to create corridors everywhere we can. The corridorization of ecosystems and integrating at the local to global scale can look like all kinds of amazingly cool things. So whether we're talking about going over highways or putting more trees and forests around the places that grow our food, the idea of creating connectivity is a local to regional to state level to national to international project that benefits us in every way. And what we're doing is thinking about the welfare of other organisms because we rely on their welfare. And this idea of protecting and transforming and restoring is both on land and in waters. And I'm just showing you land since that's where we live, but on land and in water. At global scale, there are the same priorities, of course, but they have, I've organized them according to how the most impactful aspects. So a globally strategic approach, which is how Biointegrity, the project, began. I wanted to know what's the most impactful solution to climate change. What's the number one thing I can do, or you can do, or a billionaire can do? And what I discovered is that it wasn't just shutting down coal plants. It was protecting tropical forests. That's the number one thing in terms of impact. So I'm going to share with you the top level item, according to my estimation from the science, in each of these areas: protection, transformation, and restoration. Tropical forests. I've spent much of the last 5 years talking about tropical forests, and these are the forests at the equator. Going from left to right, you've got Central America and the Amazon. Then in the middle, you've got the West African forests and the Congo. And then to the sort of right of the map, you've got the Southeast Asian forests, including China and Thailand and Vietnam, and down into Indonesia and all the way over to Papua New Guinea. These areas are critical. Madagascar is also critical. There's some missing forests that would be really beneficial to us to restore. But when we look at this system, why do I say it's the most impactful solution to climate change? Well, before that, I should say it's the most biodiverse ecosystem on the planet, that at least half of all the biodiversity on planet Earth lives in tropical forests. And that was part of this question that I was trying to answer. What's the number one solution to climate change, and what's the number one solution to the extinction crisis? Well, protecting the most biodiverse places on our planet would be the best way to stop the extinction crisis from progressing. But it's also the biggest climate influencer of all the ecosystems on the planet. So if you look at the bottom left, hopefully it's animated for you guys. This slide's been giving me some trouble, but this is showing moisture circulation. Again, this is NASA satellite imagery. The link is in the PDF. And this is about 18 years of moisture circulation around the planet, month by month. You're seeing it move. And you'll notice that it goes over the tropical forest system. There are two reasons for this. One is that it's just a property of the way the planet is organized in terms of its shape, the spin, so on at planetary scale. But it's also that the tropical forest system is extremely influential on how the moisture moves. And we have deforested this system in the last 50 years. We've taken out more than half of it. Currently, less than 18% of the original system still stands. The scale of the system is about the size. The total system is about half the size that it was, but a lot of it's regrowth already. The good news is tropical forests grow really fast, and if this other slide will animate, which it's not going to animate, it shows the same animation from NASA of carbon accumulation happening primarily in the tropics. You can see in the still here that it's focused in the Amazon, the Congo, the Southeast Asian islands. These forests are able to be productive year-round because it's warm and moist year-round. The moisture is constantly circulating and carbon is constantly being accumulated. It's a net positive system that is producing our life support services. That moisture circulation is reducing heat gain where it's hottest on the entire planet at the equator. So you can just see here that the desert, particularly the Sahara above the Congo, how densely hot it is. And south of California, it's hotter than in the Congo and in the Amazon because these systems are able to pull in the heat and use that heat to power this biological productivity. And it's just a fantastic feature of planet Earth that we need to protect and restore at the moment. All of these services, which I'm sort of running short on time, are part of what tropical forests offer the climate system. It is the biodiversity. I'm not going to go through them because I'm running short on time, but it's the biodiversity that's providing all of this service. And so carbon absorption, You saw a picture of carbon storage. The tropical forests are the most dense on land storage devices we have for holding carbon. The moisture circulation you saw, atmospheric circulation and moisture circulation are one and the same effectively. The temperature of the planet is most heavily influenced by how the tropical forest atmospheric and moisture circulation is going. Hurricane mitigation happens because tropical forests as cool systems can suck the heat out of cyclones as they're spinning up. They can also defend civilization against the impacts of heavy storms. So when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, it just tore all of the vegetation off of the forest at the south end of the island that took the brunt of the storm. But within 9 months, this forest had regrown its vegetation. You know, the defense system didn't fail. It grew back. And all of this because of the biological productivity of these systems. The other reason they're so important is because they couldn't be more urgent to defend. They're disappearing at a rate of about an acre a second. That may have slowed down in the last couple of years. But when you look at degradation and destruction of tropical forests, it nets out to about an acre a second for the last 40 or 50 years, which is why we have lost more than 50% of the original system effectively in the last 50 years. And there's more to tropical forests than just these things I mentioned. They provide about a quarter of our oxygen. They provide about a quarter of global freshwater. They contain more medicines than any other place on Earth. They are integral to food production, both because they provide food, but also because of this moisture circulation. They are the irrigating force for the planet. And there's more to say. If we protect and restore them, we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions at global scale, perhaps 25 to 50%. This is in the PDF if you want to learn more. But tropical forests are the first priority for protect in a globally strategic sense. Then we have transform. The most important thing to transform is the regenerative food system, or sorry, the food system that we have, the industrial food system. And so this compilation of stats I put together just last week, and it's from a resource that's pretty popular called Project Drawdown. And I just added up all of the regenerative food production techniques that they had compiled research on. And what it showed is that for about $1.3 trillion in startup funding, the regenerative food system could generate nearly $8 trillion in profit over the next 30 years, and at the same time reduce global emissions by about 25%. So this is, you know, why aren't we doing this already? And I have some ideas on that we can't get into, but this is equivalent to making the entire electricity system on Earth clean. No more coal plants, no more natural gas. All of the carbon that's making our electricity and heating system for the planet becoming clean would have the same net effect in terms of greenhouse emissions as regenerative food. But regenerative food is also going to help our weather. It's also going to feed us, etc. We need both. We need both and more. But this is an important concept, and that's the number one item for transformation at globally strategic scale. Then restoration. What we're talking about is both rebuilding ecosystems and leaving ecosystems alone, that we're rewilding and reintegrating ecosystems into our cities in these biologically productive areas, in the tropics in particular, and we're reconnecting things. So the concepts you saw locally, apply those to the tropics primarily. And natural forest regrowth, the study came out in September. If we just allowed all of the forests that are currently trying to regrow, that have been deforested in the last few decades, if we left them alone and allowed them to naturally regrow, we could reduce global greenhouse emissions 25%. Again, some of this overlaps with the idea of tropical reforestation. Some of this overlaps with the idea of regenerative food growth. But another 25% could come just from allowing our forest system to regrow and, again, affect our weather beneficially, affect moisture circulation beneficially. And that's nearly twice what making all of the world's transportation clean would do for us. So, you know, all of the tailpipe emissions, if we eliminated emissions from airplanes, emissions from shipping, emissions from cars and trucks and everything else, we would only reduce emissions by about 14% based on the large body of climate scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But if we just leave forests alone and let them regrow, we could reduce emissions nearly twice that. And so that's a top restoration priority for global to local biospheric integrity restoration. biospheric integrity. This is the big idea. So a quick review, you've seen this cycles of life that are propagated by the moisture movement, the history of life on our planet, that we come from a 4 billion year microbial superstructure, and it's cycling life, and the life acts, the biosphere sort of acts like food chains. That the biosphere is the cycle of cycles on this planet. We care about all this stuff because there is no other planet in the known universe that has any of this, not even a single microbe. And life is relational. Our place in the biosphere is that we are sort of in the center of it, and our economy is interacting with it. It's fed by ecosystems, and ecosystems make the biosphere. How healthy they are determines the quality of the biosphere in the future. And then tropical forests are the top global priority. Regenerative agriculture and natural reforestation are super impactful things that we can prioritize at global scale. And you can support, and I'll show you a link at the end to support tropical forests. And this idea again that, you know, there's no other place to go here. This is what we have, and so we should, I think, be excited about that. I want to try and read from, I sort of scripted out the last few slides here. And I've mentioned this quite a bit through the presentation, but there's a really important study from 2017, again in the PDF, that says the carbon sequestration provided by forests should perhaps be viewed as one co-benefit of reforestation strategies that are designed to protect and intensify the hydrologic cycle and the associated cooling. In other words, those massive carbon reductions that I showed you from natural reforestation and regenerative agriculture and tropical forest protection and restoration, that massive carbon benefit from a climate perspective is secondary to the bigger benefit of moisture circulation and cooling, and moisture circulation and biological productivity. You can see in the Amazon what moisture circulation looks like in the air there. So what can you do with all of this information? I say, you know, how about we start focusing on this planet, this biosphere, and the urgency of our future, and what our future can be. There's, you know, a lot of good design thinking that's emerging as we speak in the last few years. So from thinking at the city scale about ways to reintegrate forests and vegetation and wildlife into the places we live, this is a project that's going in right now at the base of Manhattan Island to protect Wall Street from hurricanes and from rising sea level. And it's a forestation project. And this design idea is actually not just a concept. If you haven't seen some of these amazing things, there are buildings going up, not as much in the United States, but in Europe and Asia, that are just phenomenal structures that bring together these elements and really at the moment stand as destinations and citadels of what a brighter future could look like through the integration of greenery and migration habitat for birds of prey, and thinking at the big scale about how we are part of the biosphere, and building buildings around that idea. The one on the upper right, by the way, that's a ski slope atop the cleanest waste to electricity plant in the world. That's in Copenhagen. And the emissions that come out of the top of that plant are 100% clean, but it's transforming industrial waste into electricity. And the air is so clean that they decided to make the top of the building into a ski slope. Here's another idea. This is a residence called the Mountain Dwellings, also in Copenhagen. And you can see that each apartment has a lot of natural light, and the indoor space and the outdoor space are the same. And these roof terraces are starting to grow. This is a relatively new construction, but starting to grow and fill up with vegetation that just adds to the quality of life. Here's a concept for a larger implementation of that type of idea. And then permaculture, I think, is the other thing to really emphasize today, that if you haven't heard of permaculture, please check it out. This idea of permanent agriculture is based on looking at the way wilderness and life make food and taking that and turning it into a design science. So permaculture has the biggest toolbox of resources, experience. It's been a tested and proven design science now for about 50 years. and techniques that you can use to grow just about anything anywhere, from the middle of the Jordanian desert where there's hardly any moisture and certainly no soil to the Arctic. And so back to this starting idea, I think the goal for us should be to stop and reverse this destruction of our life support system's functionality. This should be our starting point, given how serious the science that we see now says our situation is biospherically. And so, how about we focus our best efforts and our most inspired efforts and skills and technologies on making ourselves, making Austin and Central Texas and beyond the most biospherically beneficial place and era that we can. And bene, as you probably all know, means good in Italian. And about 1997, I was driving back from Houston and I heard an interview with an author. I haven't been able to find the book, but he was talking about this concept of benostrophe, which is the opposite of catastrophe. And that has never left me as, exactly, that's what we should be shooting for, the idea that a lot of good things happen at once. And so this, I think, should be the number one job of humanity. We don't know how good things could become and how good they could be for us by making Earth's ecosystems as bio-rich as they possibly can. I think our fundamental question should be, how good can we make the future? And how good can we make it with intact ecosystems? So rounding the corner here, with all this in mind, I'd like to ask all of us and ask Austin to think bigger and expect more from ourselves, of course, but primarily more from the wealthiest among us who can fund and direct this transformation of the human economy and human culture. And if you want to take action on tropical forests, Biointegrity has a solution. My project, my nonprofit, has a solutions page, and it promotes the most affordable way to help protect old growth tropical forests with community-based solutions around the world. Right now, the project that's there at biointegrity.net/solutions has $2 an acre project. You can support a group called Rainforest Trust that has a conservation fund that will protect old growth forest for $2 an acre. And the cheapest coffee at Starbucks, I think, is $2.99. So please get involved in that.